Tonight we reveal a figure rarely spoken aloud, a man whose name echoes through royal chambers and sacred spaces, believed to wield greater authority than the Pope himself. They know him as the Black Pope. For generations he has operated in full view, yet remained invisible. Dressed not in papal white, but in darkness, flowing silently through the arteries of kingdoms, academies and throne rooms. He requires no military force, he needs no seat of power. His control spreads through devotion, learning and confidences exchanged in private chambers. The Vatican may gleam as faith's public centre, but somewhere in the darkness, another figure has influenced monarchs, guided countries and even redirected the course of time. Some dismiss it as legend, others label it conspiracy. But the name Black Pope endures because the force it represents continues to persist. So before you write this off as another tale, consider this. What if the Church's most influential figure isn't the one visible in St. Peter's Square, but the one operating quietly just outside the spotlight, much like this presentation? Subscribe, because tonight we enter the realm of the Black Pope. And what unfolds may transform your understanding of authority itself. Picture a figure clothed not in brilliant white robes catching sunlight in St. Peter's Square, but in black, passing through corridors where entrance is restricted. He wears no royal insignia, sits on no throne, and draws no public adoration. Yet whispers suggest his influence extends beyond the Pope's own reach. He's called the Black Pope, a title that evokes a shadow positioned behind brightness, concealed yet commanding, both dreaded and respected. For generations, speculation has circulated that this individual possesses access not merely to matters of faith, but to intelligence that influences rulers, territories, and history's very progression. Some claim his choices have affected conflicts, moulded partnerships, and steered global events from private quarters. But who stands behind this identity? And why does his existence remain shrouded in mystery? The designation Black Pope appears in no formal registry, nor does it surface in ecclesiastical proclamations. Rather, it emerged through murmurs among detractors, theorists, and watchers who sensed there was deeper truth than publicly acknowledged. Beyond the white-robed Pope greeting the masses exists another commander, the superior general of the Society of Jesus, the man who directs the Jesuits. For some, this position represented merely a clergyman leading a spiritual society. For others, it marked the role of Earth's most formidable tactician. His garment was black, his authority enormous, and his impact unseen. That's why observers assigned him a designation that sounded simultaneously like both caution and mystery. Across time, every major centre of authority creates shadows. Caesar's seat, a monarch's crown, the papal crown itself. All have encountered challenges not from external forces, but from figures standing just beyond visibility. The Black Pope evolved into one such shadow, his image constructed as much through distrust as through fact. Those who resisted the Jesuits alleged that this concealed commander manipulated kings through quiet counsel, that he determined which powers ascended and which collapsed, and that no pope could genuinely act without his pressure from the shadows. The reality proves more elusive, but the mythology persists. Picture Europe in 1540 when the Society of Jesus came into being. It was an era of turmoil and warfare and religious upheaval. The Church was weakening its hold. Rulers were gaining strength and populations craved direction. Into this environment emerged a collective of men united by rigid pledges of fidelity and discretion, commanded by one superior who would direct them like military forces. This organisation alone created widespread unease. It resembled a hierarchy of command rather than a spiritual community, and at its summit stood one individual whose directives could cascade across territories. Small wonder observers started questioning whether his grasp rested not simply on holy texts, but on the mechanisms of history itself. The perception of the Black Pope has expanded through centuries, not from his public declarations, but from what remained unspoken. Quietness, concealment, and calculation constructed a mythology that endures today. And that's where our narrative commences. In the darkness beyond the Vatican's golden radiance, where a figure in black has been named the most commanding leader you were never intended to witness. The designation Black Pope was never authorized, never documented in church records or inscribed in stone above an entrance. It originated from murmurs, transmitted through leaflets, rumors, and mistrust, until it transformed into one of history's most unsettling labels. To grasp it, we must return to the 16th century, when civilization was being torn apart by reformations, uprisings, and religious conflicts. During that period, the Catholic Church struggled to maintain its dominance. The Protestant Reformation had undermined its credibility. Monarchs were increasingly unwilling to submit before Rome, and whole territories were starting to forge their own directions. From this chaos arose the Society of Jesus, a fresh society established in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. Unlike other spiritual communities, the Jesuits weren't isolated monks, remaining behind convent barriers. They were warriors of belief, constrained by absolute obedience, schooled in order, and trained to command. At their apex stood one man designated as the Superior General. He held no bishop's title or cardinal's rank, yet his control within the society was total. What distinguished him was that each Jesuit pledged to follow him as if he embodied divine authority on earth. This wasn't a participatory system, it was a command hierarchy, and it appeared more martial than monastic. Opponents started whispering that this superior general possessed more genuine power than the Pope himself, because while papal authority was symbolic and public, the general's was hidden, immediate and absolute. His robe was black, his command unquestionable, and quickly observers started calling him the Black Pope. The expression held multiple interpretations. On its face, it referenced the black cassock worn by Jesuits contrasting the white vestments of Rome's Pope. But underneath, it suggested something more sinister. It hinted at a competing papacy, a concealed throne, and a secret sovereign who manipulated circumstances from beyond Vatican barriers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, opponents of the Jesuits circulated pamphlets and volumes charging the Black Pope with being the genuine ruler of Catholic authority. They wrote that monarchs feared him, that sovereigns requested his approval secretly, and that even the Pope couldn't avoid his sway. Certain accusations were propaganda designed to damage the society. But like all potent speculation, they persisted, nourishing a legend that has lasted into contemporary times. Even now, when most hear the expression Black Pope, they aren't envisioning a clergyman sitting peacefully in Rome. They picture a figure wrapped in enigma, potentially a schemer in darkness, someone whose determinations echo across territories. Whether the designation emerged from reality or from defamation, it has maintained the same significance for generations. A caution, a doubt, a recognition that occasionally the most commanding sovereign isn't the one visible in brightness, but the one positioned just beyond it, directing through quietness. The narrative of the Society of Jesus starts not with a pontiff or a sovereign, but with a warrior lying injured on the combat field in 1521. His identity was Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish aristocrat whose limb had been crushed by artillery. Throughout his extended convalescence he discovered books, but rather than accounts of knights and combat, he encountered himself reading saints' biographies and sacred texts. What started as tedium gradually became a flame of belief that overtook him. He abandoned his former existence of armaments and aristocratic pursuit and embarked on a pilgrimage to worship God in a manner not confined by monastery barriers. From this individual's conversion emerged one of the most regimented and powerful societies the Catholic Church would ever witness. Ignatius assembled a modest collective of adherents, pupils, and companions who, like himself, were pursuing something beyond the conventional priesthood course. In 1534 they established a fellowship bound by pledges of poverty, celibacy, and obedience, but they incorporated something novel, a fourth pledge that distinguished them from all others: total and unquestioning submission to the Pope. Initially this might have appeared like supreme devotion, but practically it provided the collective a versatility that made them unprecedented. They were unrestricted to travel wherever papal direction sent them. Evangelists, intellectuals, and ministers who could be dispatched across continents with one directive. It was a spiritual force without boundaries. What made this fellowship even more distinctive was the framework that Ignatius constructed for it. The society was organized like a command chain. At the absolute peak stood the superior general, a figure selected for existence whose directives every Jesuit was obligated to execute. Below him existed a meticulously arranged hierarchy of provincial leaders, administrators, and superiors who managed academies, expeditions, and communities. Communication flowed constantly. Correspondence travelled back to Rome from every global region, generating a network of intelligence and authority that matched any royal administration of that era. To observers, this regimentation appeared questionable. The Jesuits appeared excessively coordinated, excessively unified, excessively prepared to comply. Opponents alleged it was inconceivable that such a framework could exist without ulterior motives. Advocates recognized in them the ideal instrument of renewal, a fellowship committed to advancing learning, protecting the Church, and ministering wherever most required. Both perspectives contained truth elements. The Jesuits were devotional men, but also action-oriented men. They infiltrated universities, counselled sovereigns, journeyed to the remotest continents, and positioned themselves at the centre of political and spiritual struggles. Their cohesion and devotion made them productive, and productivity often gets confused with domination. What originated as an injured soldier's vision quickly became a fellowship that appeared to possess observation and awareness everywhere. The foundations they established in the 16th century would eventually generate the perception of a concealed commander, the Black Pope, who directed not forces of steel but forces of intellect. The route to becoming a Jesuit was never simple, and it was never designed to be. From the outset, the Society of Jesus required a degree of dedication and regimentation that separated it from every other spiritual society of its period. Those who joined weren't merely committing their existence to belief, they were surrendering themselves completely to a structure that operated more like military command than a monastic community. The initial training phase often consumed years. A recruit would learn, worship and labour in quietness, examining his determination against the burden of submission. Unlike other societies that stressed isolation or individual worship, the Jesuits trained their participants in devotion to the collective and, most importantly, to their commander, the superior general. This was the figure whose instruction would supersede all others if he directed. They complied, not following discussion or pause, but instantly, as if the directive had descended from heaven itself. This submission became famous, both respected and feared. The pledge accepted by a Jesuit was not trivial. Beyond the promises of poverty, celibacy, and obedience shared by other spiritual societies, there existed the particular commitment of absolute surrender. In certain descriptions, opponents characterized this submission in severe terminology, stating that a Jesuit was anticipated to be like a lifeless body in his superior's grasp, motionless, responding only when directed. The terminology was startling, but it reflected the depth of surrender anticipated within the society. Such imagery helped generate the mystique surrounding them, a mystique that sparked doubts of concealed authority. Within the preparation procedure, Jesuits experienced the spiritual exercises designed by Ignatius of Loyola, a sequence of contemplations and considerations created to sharpen both spirit and intellect. These exercises pressed recruits to eliminate individual wishes and to master discerning divine intention through their superiors. It was simultaneously spiritual preparation and mental conditioning, a method of creating men who could be relied upon to execute assignments without inquiry. This framework generated a command chain unlike anything else in the Church. Directives descended with accuracy, while intelligence and data ascended in perpetual flows. Correspondents journeyed from remote expeditions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas back to Rome, where the superior general would review, assess, and guide subsequent actions. The Jesuits became recognized not merely for their devotion, but for their productivity, a network that appeared to operate with the efficiency of a concealed domain. To external observers, this pledge and structure appeared both remarkable and frightening. Supporters recognized a regimented force of belief prepared to worship God anywhere globally. Opponents recognized a structure excessively united, excessively secretive, and excessively commanding to be reliable. In this friction, the mythology of the Black Pope intensified, for if one figure could direct such submission from thousands across continents, then potentially he was beyond merely a society commander. Perhaps he was a shadow sovereign whose silent directives resonated more powerfully than the Pope's own voice. Authority doesn't always advance with forces or thunder with artillery. Occasionally it murmurs in educational halls, influences minds in confessionals, or molds spirits in peaceful expeditions. This was the invisible structure the Jesuits constructed, a network of sway so understated that it frequently went undetected, yet so powerful that it stretched from Europe to the remotest boundaries of the explored world. At the centre of this framework were academies. From the 16th century forward, the Jesuits established colleges throughout Europe, instructing not simply theology, but reasoning, natural philosophy, dialects, and classical studies. Monarchs and aristocrats dispatched their heirs to these establishments, understanding that the Jesuits provided some of the era's finest learning. Pupils who graduated from their institutions carried Jesuit thinking into administrations, royal chambers, and military forces. This wasn't raw force. It was gentle authority, moulding future territorial commanders before they even assumed crowns. Expeditions were the subsequent foundation of this concealed framework. Jesuits sailed to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, adjusting to civilizations with ability that amazed even their competitors. In China, they mastered the dialect, adopted scholars' garments, and presented themselves as companions of wisdom in South America. They constructed settlements where European and indigenous customs merged under their supervision. Wherever they travelled, they didn't merely evangelize. They watched, documented, and established influence routes that extended back to Rome. The confessional was another tool, more subtle, but potentially even more commanding. In the confidential act of confession, sovereigns unburdened their spirits to Jesuit clergy. In that holy environment, intelligence was revealed, anxieties admitted, and transgressions disclosed. Though constrained to confidentiality, Jesuits departed with comprehension of the thoughts and vulnerabilities of those holding crowns and weapons. Intelligence is authority, and no repository of information was more extensive than the shared recollections of thousands of clergy who listened quietly across continents. Royal chambers, too, experienced their presence. Jesuits frequently functioned as counselors, confessors, or instructors to monarchs, consorts, and officials. Their guidance was presented in beliefs terminology, but the consequence was intensely political. For certain sovereigns, they became essential figures who could steer not merely the spirit, but the destiny of an empire. For opponents, it appeared like control, an invisible force guiding rulers from beyond velvet barriers. By weaving these elements together, the Jesuits constructed a network requiring no military forces to maintain it. Academies shaped intellects, expeditions distributed sway. Confessionals exposed intelligence, and chambers provided access to authority. Each element alone appeared harmless, but collectively they created a network that extended across territories and through generations. External observers frequently struggled to distinguish where spiritual commitment concluded and political tactics commenced. For their advocates, the Jesuits were belief's protectors and wisdom's architects. For their adversaries, they were intelligence gatherers, conspirators, and representatives of a concealed commander. It was within this invisible structure that the mythology of the Black Pope discovered its most substantial foundation, for only a shadow sovereign could direct a network so extensive yet remain nearly invisible. Across history, sovereigns have consistently pursued wise counsel to inform their determinations. Monarchs required guidance not merely on warfare and taxation matters, but on the invisible burdens of morality and belief. Into this position stepped the Jesuits, figures schooled not simply in scripture, but in reasoning, governance, and persuasion's craft. Their attendance in royal chambers was never prominent or theatrical, but their closeness to authority generated doubts that resonated through generations. One of the initial instances can be discovered in France's court. Throughout the 16th century, Jesuit confessors grew intimate with the monarchy, steering monarchs in both spiritual concerns and political approaches. During eras of religious strife, when belief conflicts devastated the territory, these clergy positioned themselves beside sovereigns, offering counsel in instances that could establish territories' futures. Opponents alleged that the crown was no longer steered by logic or diplomacy, but by Jesuit influence. The identical patterns emerged in Spain, Portugal, and Austria, where Jesuits counselled emperors and monarchs. They instructed royal offspring, confessed ruling sovereigns, and occasionally even composed addresses or strategies in belief's designation. For their advocates, this demonstrated commitment, the Church positioning itself near sovereigns to guarantee fairness and morality. But for their adversaries, it resembled domination, a concealed force steering thrones without requiring a crown. Council's authority wasn't confined to Europe. In the 17th century, Jesuits journeyed as distant as China, where Matteo Ricci entered the imperial chamber. He impressed the Ming sovereigns with his expertise in celestial observation, calculation, and dialect. Quickly, he and his fellow Jesuits became reliable counselors on concerns extending far beyond spiritual matters. They were requested to construct calendars, counsel on ceremonies, and even participate in imperial strategy. This intimacy with an emperor thousands of distances from Rome only intensified the doubt that the Jesuits were beyond evangelists. They were negotiators, natural philosophers, and tacticians, functioning under one commander's directive. The perception of the Jesuit counselor as both confessor and advisor generated a friction that never disappeared. On one perspective stood those who accepted the Jesuits delivered learning, regimentation, and ethical guidance to sovereigns requiring it. On the opposite stood those who perceived control, a silent moulding of determinations belonging to monarchs exclusively. It was this friction that provided the concept of the Black Pope its severe edge. If one superior general could guide the behaviours of figures who counselled rulers across the globe, then his sway stretched far beyond the pulpit. It affected conflicts, agreements, and lineages in authorities' chambers, where determinations were established that moulded empires. The Jesuits were frequently present, quiet but tactical, and their attendance created a shadow. The doubt expanded not from their public statements, but from what they might have murmured beyond private barriers, utterances that could alter territories' destinies. When Ignatius of Loyola founded the Society of Jesus in 1540, he couldn't have anticipated how the superior general position would transform into one of the Catholic realm's most feared and honoured roles. Ignatius himself became the initial holder of the designation. Unlike other spiritual society commanders, he wasn't satisfied to merely steer his followers in worship and ceremony. He perceived the Jesuits as divine forces, regimented, devoted, and flexible. From his modest chamber in Rome, he guided evangelists across Europe, Asia, and the Americas through perpetual correspondence. His control was firm, his directive absolute, and his model established the pattern for every superior general that succeeded. Ignatius was succeeded by Diego Lainez, a Spaniard who assumed the responsibility following the founder's passing. In 1556, Lainez attended the Council of Trent, an assembly that would reconstruct Catholic doctrine responding to the Protestant Reformation. His addresses were incisive and compelling, demonstrating that the Jesuits weren't simply peaceful intellectuals, but active participants in the era's most critical discussions. Under his command, the society expanded additionally, securing confidence from pontiffs who depended on Jesuits as belief's defenders in a crisis period. The third superior general, Francis Borgia, provided an even more remarkable illustration of authority connected to the position. Borgia was no typical clergyman. He had previously been a duke, a figure of aristocratic lineage connected to one of Spain's most powerful families. His determination to surrender prosperity and status to minister to the Jesuits astonished Europe. When he became superior general in 1565, he provided the society not merely spiritual substance, but also noble associations. Under Borgia, the Jesuits expanded in status and obtained sway at royal chambers, reinforcing their perception as figures who could transition smoothly between palaces and expeditions. As years progressed, each superior general contributed another dimension to the office's credibility. Claudio Acquaviva, who ministered from 1581 to 1615, refined the internal authority framework. He supervised the composition of the Jesuit constitutions, a manuscript that solidified the submission and regimentation regulations. Acquaviva expanded the network of academies and colleges, transforming learning into a foundation of Jesuit character. His extended period of command proved that the superior general wasn't a provisional guide, but a lifelong director, a figure whose determinations could mould the society for generations. By the 17th century, the superior general figure had become simultaneously respected and feared. His credibility extended across oceans, transmitted through correspondence and reliable representatives. His instruction could establish the destiny of expeditions in China, colleges in France, or conversions in South America. For external observers, this degree of domination appeared nearly inconceivable. For internal participants, it was merely the society's natural framework. From Ignatius forward, the superior general position emerged as a role unprecedented in the Church. A throne without royal insignia, an authority without formal designation, and the living foundation of the mythology that would eventually be designated the Black Pope. Long before administrations constructed intelligence organizations or territories generated covert operations, the Jesuits had already perfected the craft of collecting and administering intelligence. Their instrument was not the blade, but the writing instrument, and their battlefield was the perpetual circulation of ink and parchment. From the 16th century forward, every Jesuit evangelist, instructor, and clergyman was obligated to compose detailed accounts to Rome. These weren't informal correspondence, but meticulously organized narratives describing local governance, civilization, dialect, and even the confidential dispositions of monarchs and aristocrats. Across time, the Society of Jesus headquarters became an enormous clearinghouse of intelligence, potentially history's initial genuine global information network. Picture a Jesuit in Japan throughout 1580, characterizing the shogun's traditions and the struggles among military commanders. Simultaneously, another Jesuit in Brazil was documenting the Amazon's tribes and Portuguese colonists' activities. Meanwhile, in Europe, Jesuits in royal chambers documented monarchs' well-being, officials' competitions, and insurrections' murmurs. All these communications journeyed back to Rome, where the superior general and his councillors reviewed them, examined them, and issued directives reciprocally. It was a framework so structured and extensive that numerous rulers couldn't equal its breadth. What made this practice so productive was not simply the substance, but the regimentation. Jesuits were schooled to watch attentively, to record particulars others overlooked, and to convey facts with accuracy. They characterized territories, commercial pathways, and even celestial observations with natural philosophical precision. But integrated into these accounts were perceptions about governance, partnerships, and individual weaknesses of local commanders. This combining of scholarship and tactics made Jesuit correspondence treasures of wisdom and foundations of doubt. For advocates, they were dedication evidence, a global network unified by belief and scholarship. For adversaries, they appeared like a concealed empire's observation and awareness. Opponents started murmuring that no sovereign was protected from Jesuit observation, that every chamber had its confessor, every municipality its academy, and every global region its account awaiting transport to Rome. Whether these anxieties were magnified or not, they expose perception's authority. Intelligence once collected and centralized becomes sway. A ruler who requested Jesuit guidance might never comprehend that his determinations were already being examined and documented thousands of distances away. But by the 17th century, the correspondence quantity was astounding. The Society of Jesus archives containing millions of pages spanning every continent and topic. Even currently, historians are amazed by these accounts' particularity, characterizing everything from Chinese celestial science to African tribes' diets. The Jesuits had constructed a mechanism that transformed ink and parchment into strategy-molding policies not merely for expeditions, but for territories. It was this invisible authority that provided strength to the Black Pope mythology. For only a commander with global perception could direct an intelligence force long before civilization had terminology for information gathering. In a church's quietness, distant from chambers and battlefield's commotion, there exists a location where even the most commanding kneel. The confessional, a modest wooden enclosure with a shadow screen, became one of history's most significant influence corridors. Here, monarchs and consorts, commanders and officials exposed their spirits, admitting transgressions they would never acknowledge publicly. For the Jesuits, who frequently functioned as confessors, this wasn't a location for condemnation, but for steering. Yet with every murmured utterance, they obtained perception into sovereigns' thoughts and territory's delicate equilibrium. The Confession Act was sacred, constrained by confidentiality, but the wisdom it provided moulded how Jesuits comprehended existence. A ruler might admit remorse over a conflict, uncertainty about a partnership, or betrayal anxiety. These anxieties exposed more than tactics ever could. In listening with tolerance and guidance, Jesuit confessors became reliable counselors, their sway extending beyond transgression forgiveness. Opponents charged them with utilizing that confidence as manipulation. They alleged that Jesuits, through confession, could guide sovereigns toward determinations that corresponded with the society's and its superior generals' concerns. Whether accurate or magnified, the concept circulated, generating doubt that the Black Pope governed not through forces, but through remorseful monarchs' murmurs. One notable illustration is discovered in 17th century France, where Jesuit confessors steered rulers during perpetual strife between Catholics and Protestants. The guidance provided in those enclosures could signify the distinction between conflict and harmony. In Spain, Jesuits functioned as confessors to royal lineages for generations, moulding empire strategies while remaining wrapped in spiritual duty's quietness. Even beyond Europe, in Asia's emperor chambers and South America's aristocratic families, the identical pattern emerged. The confessional wasn't simply a ceremony, it was a negotiation channel. For advocates, this intimacy was a blessing. They perceived it as confirmation that sovereigns were being steered by belief figures, that morality and ethics influenced governance determinations. For adversaries, it resembled control, as if rulers were marionettes and Jesuits the invisible forces that manipulated their movements. The reality probably existed somewhere intermediate, but perception frequently equals fact's authority. What mattered was that sovereigns relied on their Jesuit confessors intensely, occasionally more than their own officials or relatives. In that confidence, doubt flourished. Picture a commander prepared to advance, forces pausing because of a clergy's guidance. Picture a pact postponed or revised following a murmured exchange in a shadow enclosure. These instances, invisible to history's documentation, maintained significance that could shift empires. The Black Pope mythology fed on such narratives. For if one superior general directed monarchs' confessors, then his control reached every authority region. In the confessional's quietness, negotiation and belief merged, and civilization transformed without one voice being elevated publicly. When observers envision authority, they frequently picture forces or gold treasures. But the Jesuits grasped something more understated. They recognized that the most substantial sway rested not in armaments or prosperity, but in young intellects moulding. From the 16th century forward, the Society of Jesus constructed academies throughout Europe and far beyond. These weren't simple classrooms where offspring learned to recite worship. They were excellence centres where reasoning, natural philosophy, written works and dialects were instructed at degrees unequalled by most period establishments. Quickly, aristocrats and monarchs' heirs occupied these academies, positioned alongside merchants and commanders' offspring, common individuals all moulded under identical, meticulous instruction. The Jesuits accepted that learning was divine service, but it was also a sway instrument. A prince who learned under Jesuit instructors transported their thinking method into the throne chamber. An official schooled in their approaches moulded empires' strategies. Even profound thinkers and natural philosophers discovered themselves steered, occasionally tested by Jesuit educators who required regimentation and thought precision. The program was demanding. Pupils mastered Latin and Greek not merely as dialects, but as portals to ancient civilizations' wisdom. They learned rhetoric to refine their expression, reasoning to prepare their logic, and theology to secure their belief. Calculation and celestial observation were also instructed, demonstrating that the Jesuits appreciated natural philosophy as equally as scripture. This combination of intellectual breadth and spiritual substance generated graduates who could navigate chambers, universities, and battlefields with equivalent assurance. Guardians acknowledged this benefit rapidly. By the 17th century, Jesuit academies had become Europe's elites' preferred preparation locations. Rulers desired their successors educated there. Officials dispatched their offspring, anticipating securing future sway. Even the Church's competitors admitted Jesuit instruction quality. The Society's classrooms became silent leadership factories, generating figures who would govern territories, command forces, and mould concepts that persisted for generations. Yet with this achievement came doubt. Critics murmured that Jesuit schools prioritized control over genuine education. They claimed the order was planting seeds of devotion that would eventually blossom into absolute obedience to the Black Pope. Every pupil who walked through their gates, they insisted, bore an invisible stamp of Jesuit conditioning, whether he recognized it or not. Truth or fabrication aside, the outcome was undeniable. Jesuit teaching left a lasting mark on Europe's intellectual and political landscape. The order had discovered a method to influence tomorrow, not through coercion, but by moulding the men who would shape tomorrow with their own hands. In the lengthy corridors of Jesuit academies, with their stained writing desks and reverberating chants, the myth of unseen authority grew stronger. Because if the superior general controlled the academies, then he controlled the thoughts of those meant to govern. The Jesuits climbed swiftly in reputation and power, yet that ascent brought anxiety and bitterness. By the closing years of the 16th century, the order had already established schools, outposts, and councillors across multiple continents. Their organization and extent made them admired. But to countless observers beyond the church, it appeared as something different. It appeared as a concealed dominion. From this distrust, a myth started to take shape, one that would tarnish their standing for generations. It became known as the Black Legend. This narrative wasn't recorded in formal chronicles, but in the leaflets and declarations of their adversaries. Competing religious factions, envious aristocrats, and even rulers who felt challenged by the Jesuits all contributed their criticism. They charged the order with being deceptive, with influencing monarchs through the confessional, with conducting espionage on kingdoms, and with scheming to dominate the world from the shadows. At the heart of these charges stood the figure of the superior general. Since he dressed in the black garment of the Jesuits, and since his influence appeared to cross boundaries, people assigned him a title designed to stir both dread and mistrust. They named him the Black Pope. Leaflets circulated throughout Europe, depicting this figure as more threatening than any monarch or even the pontiff in Rome. They portrayed him as someone who could direct thousands with one command, who stationed his members in every palace, and who possessed knowledge no one else could access. These writings frequently blended fact with falsehood, actual occurrences with embellishments, constructing an impression so striking that it lodged in the collective mind. For ordinary citizens who didn't completely grasp the internal mechanisms of the church, the concept was simple to accept. They noticed Jesuits everywhere, instructing their offspring, counselling their leaders, and speaking softly in confessional booths. It seemed as though the order was constantly there, constantly observing. To them, the notion of a secret pontiff in black manipulating events felt less like fantasy and more like the single reasonable answer. Kings who confronted Jesuits intensified the situation. When Jesuits questioned royal authority or opposed policies that conflicted with their purpose, monarchs branded them as traitors. Banishments occurred in nations like France, Portugal, and Spain. Each banishment arrived with passionate rhetoric. Proclamations and published writings characterized the Jesuits as threats to the nation. These charges travelled across frontiers more rapidly than reality could follow. Even when the Jesuits responded with logical defences, the spectre of the Black Pope grew bigger. The myth was too sensational, too captivating, and too advantageous for their opponents to discard. By the 17th century, the Black Pope was no longer merely a label spoken in private. It had transformed into a symbol echoed in disputes, religious addresses, and political arguments. It represented distrust, apprehension of concealed authority, and the conviction that behind the pontiff clothed in white, there existed another pontiff clothed in black who actually governed. Whether it was reality or invention mattered less than the impact it produced. The Black Legend formed not because it was verified, but because it was accepted. And acceptance, particularly when nourished by alarm, can be stronger than reality itself. By the 18th century, the Jesuits had grown into one of the most influential and divisive orders in the Catholic Church. Their academies trained leaders, their outposts covered continents, and their confessors spoke quietly in the presence of rulers. But the exact power that made them respected also made them threatening in the perception of monarchs. European rulers started to view the Jesuits not as partners, but as competitors, a system that could contest royal dominance while professing allegiance to Rome. What emerged was one of the most striking suppressions in ecclesiastical history, a series of expulsions that appeared intended to eliminate the order permanently. In the year 1759, the Kingdom of Portugal acted initially. The Marquis of Pombal, an influential administrator, blamed the Jesuits of interfering in governance and opposing changes. He commanded them removed, their academies shuttered, and their assets confiscated merely a few years afterward. France complied, influenced by officials who regarded the Jesuits as a danger to monarchical power. By 1767, Spain and Naples participated in forcing the order from their territories and dispersing thousands of clergy across the world. The ultimate strike arrived in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV, under tremendous pressure from European rulers, released a decree officially dissolving the Society of Jesus. Instantaneously, an order that had formerly been the most effective instrument of the Church was legally abolished. To external observers, it seemed like the conclusion, yet the Jesuits didn't genuinely vanish. Their power had never resided in thrones or military forces, but in their structure, a network of commitment and order that no proclamation could completely sever. In territories where the dissolution was not implemented, such as Prussia and Russia, the order silently persisted. Catherine the Great of Russia declined to remove them, understanding their worth as teachers. In secrecy, Jesuits maintained their activities, instructing, guiding, and composing, preserving the essence of the order, even while the organization itself was formally terminated. For 41 years, the Jesuits existed in this peculiar state. Prohibited officially, but functioning in reality, their endurance was remarkable. Without official acknowledgement or papal backing, they sustained communication, protected their customs, and anticipated. In the year 1814, Pope Pius VII revived the Society of Jesus, pronouncing it once more a recognized order of the Church. What surprised many was how rapidly the Jesuits regrouped. Within years, their schools threw open their doors again, their missions sprang back to life, and their advisors slipped back into courts and universities. It was as though the suppression had been nothing more than an interruption, a scar that faded with remarkable swiftness. This endurance pointed to something fundamental about the order. It wasn't merely an institution, but a breathing web of discipline, tradition, and devotion that could absorb even the cruelest strikes. To their adversaries, this persistence was evidence of scheming, a signal that the Jesuits were unstoppable because they were something beyond mortal. To their allies, it was evidence of heavenly blessing. Either way, the myth of the Black Pope only gained momentum. For an organization that refuses to die feels more like a phantom empire than a fellowship of clergy. The Superior General of the Jesuits existed within a contradiction that both shaped his power and stoked the doubts surrounding him. On the surface, he was the most faithful servant of the papacy, tied by a promise that distinguished the Jesuits from every other order in the Catholic Church. While monks vowed poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits vowed something further, a fourth pledge of absolute surrender to the Pope. If the Pope ordered them to cross an ocean or enter the palace of a dangerous king, they complied without question. This should have rendered the Superior General nothing more than a tool of papal authority. Yet history reveals a more intricate picture. In reality, the Superior General directed thousands of men scattered across every landmass. These men reported not straight to the Pope, but to him. Every message, every account, every directive passed through his headquarters in Rome before it touched the broader world. This made the general the centre of a worldwide system, more informed about happenings in distant territories than the papacy itself. Popes depended on Jesuit wisdom and their institutions, yet some grew to dread the very framework they had sanctioned. To skeptics, it appeared as though the Pope in white possessed the crown, but the Pope in black possessed the controls. The strain became most apparent in moments of turmoil when popes wrestled with kings. Jesuits were frequently already embedded in those courts. As spiritual guides or counsellors, the Superior General could direct their movements with orders that were technically in allegiance to the papacy, but occasionally appeared to rush ahead or even eclipse it. In this manner, the Jesuits stood accused of running a second hub of authority, one that steered the world toward Rome, but through the grip of the general rather than the Pope directly. The contradiction intensified when banishment arrived in the 18th century. Rulers blamed the Jesuits for serving not the Pope, but their general. Ironically enough, when Pope Clement XIV disbanded the order in 1773, it was viewed less as papal decree and more as capitulation to political force. To skeptics, this demonstrated that the Black Pope's influence had stretched too far. If monarchs insisted the Jesuits be muzzled, then clearly they must have wielded more strength than the papacy itself. When the order was revived in 1814, the contradiction came back. The vow of submission to the Pope stayed unbroken, yet the system that gathered authority in the grasp of one man persisted. This strain never vanished. Even in the contemporary age, when Jesuits wielded sway in academies, governance and research, the same wariness remained. How could one man clothed in black and called the General inspire such allegiance around the globe while still professing to serve in flawless obedience? The contradiction became the root of legend. For allies, it was evidence of the commitment. For opponents, it was evidence of intrigue. And at the heart of it all stood the superior general, a figure caught between Rome and the globe, between submission and command, between the perception of servant and the reputation of sovereign. In the centre of Rome there exists a humble chamber that bears a significance disproportionate to its dimensions. It isn't decorated with gold like the Vatican chambers, nor does it showcase thrones or treasures. Yet from this chamber, the superior general of the Jesuits manages a system that reaches across land masses. The walls are plain, bordered with rows of books and documents. A desk stands at the middle, frequently buried under letters that have journeyed weeks or months from the most remote edges of the earth. This is the headquarters of a figure recognized by many as the Black Pope. The day starts. Early dispatches come in from Jesuit schools in Europe, outposts in Asia, and settlements in the Americas. Each letter is more than correspondence. It's a fragment of intelligence, outlining political transformations, cultural movements, and the rhythm of countries. The superior general studies attentively, cross-referencing information, evaluating choices, and marking where action may be needed. A provincial leader in South America may be leaning on a mission, a royal chamber in France may be considering new regulations, or an academy in Germany may be encountering resistance. Every issue is examined, and each reply is constructed with care. Meetings come next. Jesuits from various regions journey to Rome requesting guidance. They step into the general's chamber softly, often anxious in the company of the figure who represents their pledges of obedience. He absorbs their obstacles, poses pointed inquiries, and delivers instructions that may redirect the trajectory of their assignments. His tone is measured but firm, for he understands that devotion depends not solely on power, but equally on confidence. Between meetings, the general confers with his inner circle, figures selected to help in the work of overseeing a global order. Side by side, they chart out approaches, prepare reactions to dangers, and debate the positioning of reliable members into critical roles. The pace is constant but demanding, a coordination of choices that must weigh spiritual calling against political truth. The afternoon frequently brings encounters with outsiders, envoys, and church representatives who want the general's insight. Though he is tied to submission to the Pope, many approach him straight away, recognizing his influence reaches into lecture halls, confession booths, and palaces. Every conversation adds another dimension of duty, another opportunity to influence the direction of countries. Silently, from behind a work table. As the evening approaches, the chamber fills once more with documents. Composed replies are approved and stamped, prepared to journey back across waters and peaks. Directives to evangelists, support to educators, guidance to confessors, all written in a manner that merges strength with conviction. By the moment the lanterns are kindled, the superior general has affected the existence of thousands without departing his chamber. To the world beyond this daily pattern, many consider it ordinary, but to those who grasp the network it embodies, it is remarkable. The general's chamber is not simply a workspace. It is the concealed nucleus of an empire without frontiers, where the motion of a quill can resonate across land masses. It is here, in the silent rigour of each day, that the myth of the Black Pope assumes substance. When the Jesuits embarked across the waters in the 16th and 17th centuries, they brought with them more than the crucifix and the scriptures. They brought mastery of tongues, sciences, and traditions that enabled them to integrate into societies in ways few Europeans ever managed. Their outposts were sites of devotion and learning, but to many watchers, they also resembled bases of calculation, connections between continents and Rome. In South America, Jesuits founded what came to be known as the reductions, establishments where native populations existed under Jesuit supervision. These were not basic hamlets. They contained schools, factories, and even musical ensembles. The inhabitants learned melody, agriculture, and trades, while being exposed to Christianity. Onlookers wondered at their structure, but doubters argued they were too refined, too autonomous, almost like miniature republics inside greater empires. Whispers circulated that the Jesuits were constructing nations of their own, faithful not to the monarchy, but to their superior general. Whether this held truth or not, the mistrust lingered. In Asia, the approach was distinct, but just as remarkable. In India and China, Jesuits tackled missions with cultural sophistication. They wore garments like intellectuals, examined local teachings, and conquered intricate languages. Matteo Ricci in China amazed the imperial chamber by not only conversing in fluent Mandarin, but also presenting charts, timepieces, and celestial computations more precise than the Chinese had ever witnessed. To many, he appeared less a missionary and more an emissary, a figure who could operate in the uppermost circles of influence. Jesuits became counselors to rulers, presenting Western knowledge while subtly spreading Christian ideas. In Japan, they transformed again, absorbing traditions and interacting with military leaders as peers. Their capacity to merge so effortlessly into civilization sparked respect, but also doubt. How could these figures navigate so readily among populations so alien from their own, unless they were prepared not merely as clergy, but as tacticians for rulers back in Europe? This adaptability was a blade with two edges. On one side, the Jesuits stretched the scope of Christianity farther than any other order. On the other, their allegiance to the superior general, rather than to any specific crown, made them appear like representatives of a veiled force. Accounts of their outposts arrived in Rome in hefty letters packed with particulars about terrain, commerce and governance, intelligence precious far beyond the chapel. This is why some insisted the outposts were not solely about spirits, but equally about calculation. The Jesuits themselves maintained they were only serving the divine and the Pope, but their capacity to collect intelligence and forge trust wherever they travelled made many uncomfortable. From the wilderness of Paraguay to the chambers of Beijing, the Jesuits left marks that were difficult to dismiss. They instructed, they cured, they transformed. But they also constructed webs of sway that crossed waters. To their admirers, this was evidence of sacred mission. To their detractors, it was evidence of plotting. Either way, the mission territories became hidden battlegrounds, locations where the myth of the Black Pope extended beyond Rome into the very core of the earth. For the Jesuits, rescuing spirits was not solely a question of worship, but equally of understanding. They grasped that to earn confidence in foreign territories or at royal chambers, they had to present something of worth beyond preaching. This is why the Society of Jesus gained recognition not just for its outposts, but for its expertise in astronomy, languages, and mathematics. These disciplines were more than knowledge. They were instruments of sway, a form of exchange that unlocked access and fostered regard. In the late 16th century, Jesuits became some of the foremost astronomers in Europe. They examined the cosmos not solely for voyaging, but equally for the calendars that steered planting, celebrations and commerce. When they delivered this understanding overseas, they stunned leaders in China. Jesuits displayed celestial charts more exact than those of the imperial experts. They forecasted eclipses with precision, something that granted them tremendous standing at the emperor's chamber. To the Chinese, these figures in black garments were not just evangelists, but authorities of the firmament. By merging knowledge with conviction, Jesuits established themselves as confidants, counselors. Languages was another domain where they thrived. Jesuits did not land in new territories expecting natives to acquire their speech. Instead, they conquered the languages they discovered. They examined indigenous speech in South America, documented Asian writing, and produced lexicons and grammars that stay significant even now. This capability to communicate straight to populations in their native words shattered obstacles that others couldn't breach. It also granted Jesuits entry to civilizations in manners that penetrated far deeper than shallow exchange. Through speech, they secured confidence, but they equally accumulated understanding, charting the beliefs and customs of whole civilizations. Mathematics, likewise, became a potent tool in their scholarly collection. Jesuit schools in Europe instructed pupils in logic, geometry, and calculation, and this proficiency journeyed with evangelists in India. Jesuits participated with experts on mathematical concepts comparing Western and Eastern approaches. In Europe, their instructors moulded future rulers by preparing them in thinking and analysis. Mastery in figures, like mastery of heavens, became another method to exhibit competence and secure sway. Doubters insisted this fusion of knowledge and conviction was not innocent. They contended that Jesuits employed understanding as advantage, presenting it to leaders in return for entry, faithfulness, or safety. A monarch who trusted a Jesuit for reliable voyaging or an accurate calendar might equally be more receptive to the Jesuits' guidance on governance or faith. Whether deliberate or not, this trade of knowledge for confidence made the order appear less like evangelists and more like planners. By the 17th century, the standing of Jesuits as experts had travelled across the planet. Their observatories, collections, and schools were respected even by those who mistrusted them. To their supporters, this was evidence that conviction and logic could advance together to their adversaries. It was evidence that the Jesuits were spinning understanding into a trap of domination. In both perspectives, the outcome was identical. The Society of Jesus converted the knowledge of spirits into the knowledge of command, proving that sometimes a viewing instrument or a language manual could shape history as profoundly as any throne or blade. The Jesuits were frequently embraced into royal chambers as confessors, instructors, and counselors, but their proximity to command also sparked unavoidable friction. Strife. Rulers who viewed themselves as absolute masters of their domains did not always welcome a religious order that responded to a superior in Rome rather than to the monarchy. Repeatedly through the 17th and 18th centuries, confrontations erupted, instances when the Jesuits encountered both the boundaries of their sway and their strange capacity to resurface even after being driven away. In France, pressures mounted as Jesuit confessors steered monarchs during periods of religious conflict. Their counsel to maintain Catholic doctrine earned them approval with some, but distrust with others. Competitors at court murmured that the Jesuits were manipulating threads behind the seat of power, and bitterness grew among officials who desired sway of their own. At moments, Jesuits were banished, only to discover their route back through the confidence of a fresh monarch or the faithfulness of pupils trained in their institutions. In Spain and Portugal, the frictions ran stronger. Jesuits in South America had formed reductions, settlements where native populations existed under their supervision. These establishments were praised for their structure and output, but royal representatives dreaded they were too autonomous, too faithful to the Jesuit general rather than the monarchy. Charges emerged that the Jesuits were forming their own domain within a domain. By the middle 18th century, these doubts resulted in striking banishments, with thousands of Jesuits driven out of territories and compelled to abandon lands they had worked for generations. Yet even these displays of royal strength did not completely wipe out their footprint. Many Jesuits discreetly stayed in areas where leaders accepted them, and their sway persisted through the volumes they composed and the pupils they had prepared. The most critical friction arrived with the dissolution of the order in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV, under tremendous pressure from the Bourbon rulers, formally abolished the Society of Jesus. To the globe, it appeared like a conclusive triumph for monarchs over the Black Pope. But the narrative did not conclude there. Even during the period of dissolution, Jesuits discovered methods to persist. In Russia, Catherine the Great declined to implement the prohibition, permitting them to maintain teaching and safeguarding their framework. In Prussia, they stayed operational under the shelter of the government. And when the papacy revived the order in 1814, the Jesuits swiftly came back to former strongholds, reconstructing schools and outposts with astonishing velocity. These patterns of banishment and comeback expose something striking about the order. They were never unbeatable, but they were flexible. When an entrance was blocked by a monarch, they located another through a consort, an official, or even through the faithfulness of the population. Their persistence only strengthened the myth of the Black Pope. For how could an organisation suppressed by so many leaders always discover its route back unless it held some concealed force? The frictions with rulers demonstrated the boundaries of their command. But the comebacks demonstrated something more unsettling, a tenacity that made them appear less like an ordinary order and more like a phantom that could never be wiped away. One of the most striking characteristics of the Jesuits has always been their recall. While kingdoms emerged and crumbled, dynasties disintegrated, and empires dissolved into history, the Society of Jesus transmitted its understanding with a rigour that matched any nation. This was not the recall of people alone, but of an organisation that prized records, exchanges, and persistence above everything else. Through messages, accounts, and meticulously preserved materials, the Jesuits formed what some experts term the most comprehensive record of the early modern globe. From the instant the order was established in 1540, every Jesuit evangelist and instructor was required to compose routine accounts. These were not informal entries, but exact recordings outlining everything from regional governance to scholarly findings. They reached Rome by vessel, by convoy, and by courier, from creating a steady stream of intelligence that was organised, duplicated, and safeguarded. The superior general depended on this torrent of ink to reach choices, but the genuine strength rested in the reality that the intelligence was never erased. Even when rulers expelled the Jesuits or when the papacy itself disbanded the order in 1773, the recall of the society remained. Records were concealed, defended, or discreetly moved to secure locations. When the Jesuits were revived in 1814, they reopened their archives and proceeded as though no break had taken place. Their recall spanned the interval of 40 years with an ease that shocked observers. This persistence granted the Jesuits a benefit that few could rival. A monarch could rule for generations, but when death came, his hidden knowledge vanished with him. A government might maintain archives, but conflict and revolution often wiped them clean. The Jesuits, however, safeguarded their institutional knowledge. Through the ages, they understood which approaches had worked in Asian territories, which educational institutions had flourished in Europe, which partnerships had crumbled in South American lands. This provided them a subtle yet formidable advantage. They could revisit a territory after generations away and still retain the dialects, the traditions, and the failures of earlier times. Detractors claim this made them threatening, an organisation that truly never lost its memory and thus could never be overcome. To advocates, it demonstrated their rigour and dedication, individuals devoted not merely to religion, but to scholarship and documentation. Currently, researchers continue to be amazed by the extent of Jesuit collections. From celestial measurements in China to accounts of indigenous societies in the Amazon, from intricate charts of unknown territories to correspondence about the machinations of European monarchies, the records span endless rows of storage. They represent a goldmine for contemporary research, yet in previous eras they meant something even more significant. They served as the continuous memory of an organization that survived monarchs and pontiffs together. This extended memory became woven into the mythology of the Black Pope, because if information equals influence, then an organization that never lost track and could retrieve incidents with accuracy generations afterward possessed a type of influence superior to thrones or military forces. It was the ability to recall when all others had forgotten. From their inception, the Jesuits pledged total submission to the pontiff. Yet historical evidence shows a more intricate relationship between the white garments of Peter's heir and the black garments of the superior general. Certain pontiffs embraced the Jesuits as faithful champions, while others viewed them with apprehension, recognizing that the organization's structure and scope granted it a capability unequaled by any other division of the Church. This fluctuating equilibrium of approval and anxiety became one of the mechanisms that sustained the Black Pope legend living. During the 16th century, Pope Paul III granted formal recognition to the Society of Jesus, acknowledging the brilliance of Ignatius of Loyola's conception. Subsequently, pontiffs depended extensively on Jesuit intellectuals throughout the Counter-Reformation, dispatching them into Protestant territories as evangelists and educators. For these pontiffs, the Jesuits represented an instrument of belief, a presence that could rival the passion of their adversaries with intellect, rhetoric, and commitment. Their achievements in educational institutions and evangelism appeared to validate papal judgment in bestowing them such power. Still, with every achievement came apprehension. Pontiffs could not overlook that the superior general directed thousands of individuals who followed him with complete fidelity. When correspondence from every landmass arrived at the general's office instead of straight into papal possession, some grew concerned that information and influence were gathering beyond the Vatican's immediate oversight. Pontiffs like Clement XIV experienced the demands of monarchs who insisted that the Jesuits be restrained. During 1773, Clement released the declaration dissolving the organization, a measure that dismantled the Society of Jesus officially, though not in reality. To detractors, this demonstrated that the Black Pope had become so powerful that solely the pontiff himself could suppress him. And even then, the suppression proved temporary. When Pope Pius VII reinstated the organization in 1814, it confirmed another aspect of the relationship. Pontiffs could not function comfortably without the Jesuits. For extended periods, their educational institutions, evangelism, and intellectual vitality proved too essential. Once more, the balance returned to approval. This cycle persisted into contemporary periods. Certain pontiffs depended significantly on Jesuit guidance, while others wavered, concerned that the organization's autonomy might eclipse papal power. Even Pope Francis, the initial Jesuit to occupy the papal seat, revived old debates. Did his history as an affiliate of the organization demonstrate that the boundary between pontiff and Black Pope had finally dissolved? Or did it reveal that the legend remained vibrant and active? Still murmuring in the backdrop of Catholic influence, the reality is that the Jesuits and the papacy have always existed connected in both confidence and strain. The Pope holds supremacy, yet the superior general inspires fidelity that matches it. This peculiar relationship with movements of nearness and movements of distrust guarantees that the mythology of the Black Pope never disappears. For as long as pontiffs both require and dread the Jesuits, the legend of a phantom authority in black garments will persist in flourishing. The Jesuits were recognized not solely for their educational institutions and evangelism, but for their internal rigor, a spirituality molded by the principles of Ignatius of Loyola. At the core of this rigor were the spiritual exercises, a collection of contemplations and techniques created to refine the spirit like steel. These exercises included quietness, contemplation, and a systematic approach of choice-making termed discernment. For those within the organization, these techniques represented a method of harmonizing every selection with divine purpose. For those beyond, they appeared enigmatic, even clandestine, and it was within that confusion that the mystique of the Black Pope started to expand. The spiritual exercises required weeks of quietness, where the Jesuit undergoing formation scrutinized his moral compass in depth. He would visualize moments from Christ's existence, position himself within them, and grapple with the longings and anxieties of his own spirit. This quietness was not void, but concentration, an instruction in rigor that made Jesuits famous for their mental precision and fortitude of determination. External observers, nevertheless, frequently mistook this peaceful commitment as concealment. If Jesuits appeared cautious or controlled, individuals presumed they were concealing something instead of exercising spiritual rigor. Discernment, another fundamental technique, instructed Jesuits to evaluate selections not through instinct but through profound contemplation. Every choice was measured against internal tranquility, consistency with belief, and enduring intention. This approach provided the organization and remarkable forbearance. While others hurried, Jesuits appeared to pause, watching until the proper direction emerged. To authorities and competitors, this forbearance seemed calculated, even deceptive, as if Jesuits were perpetually scheming something obscured from perception. Icons contributed another dimension of confusion. The Jesuits embraced the characters Iches, the initial 3 characters of Jesus' name in Greek, as their symbol. To them, it represented a straightforward statement of commitment, but adversaries distorted it into peculiar explanations, asserting it was a cipher for concealed communications or an indication of hidden power. The black garments they dressed in, an emblem of modesty and detachment from earthly pride, created the actual designation Black Pope. What was intended as plainness seemed to others as darkness and influence. Even their practices in quietness stimulated distrust. In a society where vocal argument and open addresses characterized politics, a collective that prized peaceful contemplation seemed foreign. Individuals started to speculate that Jesuits possessed concealed ceremonies, that their quietness was not devotion but conspiracy. The reality was considerably less sensational, but equally formidable. Their spirituality established a rigor that made them impressive. They could withstand difficulty, adjust to unfamiliar societies, and remain steadfast under strain because they had been conditioned internally first. Yet, through the perspective of society, this rigor merged into concealment. Thus, the techniques of Ignatius, originating from an aspiration to cleanse the spirit, accidentally contributed elements to the mythology of the Black Pope. Quietness transformed into concealment, icons transformed into ciphers, and discernment transformed into deception. The confusion persisted, nourishing a legend that has endured for generations, a legend where spirituality and influence are perpetually mistaken. When individuals contemplate concealed influence, they frequently envision shadowy chambers, secured collections and murmurs behind sealed entrances. Yet some of the most lasting impact of the Jesuits has consistently been in open view. Educational institutions, congregations, academies, and even contemporary non-governmental associations bear their identity and character. To the informal observer, these establishments appear routine places of learning, devotion, or assistance. Yet when observed collectively across nations and generations, they constitute a framework of associations that few associations on the planet can equal. From the 16th century forward, Jesuit institutions became renowned throughout Europe. Pupils instructed in their classrooms included prospective monarchs, officials, and authors. As the generations advanced, these academies expanded, extending to the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Currently, designations like Georgetown, Fordham and Sophia University are acknowledged globally, indications that the Jesuit philosophy of learning persists active. Each establishment operates independently, yet all follow their lineage to the identical founding conception. Connected together, they establish not merely dispersed academies, but a worldwide educational network united by common values. Beyond learning, Jesuit congregations and spiritual centers discreetly assist populations in urban areas and settlements. They may resemble basic churches or facilities for devotion, but they additionally operate as points of association, connecting lay people to the broader purpose of the organization. During periods of emergency, these populations have frequently activated quicker than authorities providing protection, learning, or assistance. Their existence is unremarkable until one considers and understands how many points emerge on the chart. During the 20th century, the Jesuits broadened into the realm of community action, operating charities and advocacy collectives and non-governmental associations. These initiatives combat destitution, protect human entitlements and advance fairness. On the exterior, they mirror the efforts of innumerable other humanitarian collectives, but their scope is enhanced by the worldwide Jesuit framework. An initiative in Latin America can link straight with intellectuals in Europe or campaigners in Asia, trading resources and approaches with velocity that matches any political partnership. Detractors contend that this framework of routine establishments conceals a stronger cohesion, a framework that can be guided like a singular entity by the superior general in Rome. To them, an educational institution is not merely an educational institution, but an incubator of impact. A congregation is not merely a congregation, but a surveillance position in the existence of an urban centre. An NGO is not merely charity, but a refined extension of a grander blueprint. Advocates reject such doubts, indicating that the efforts are visible and the objectives are openly declared. Yet the legend of the Black Pope prospers on the notion that what appears routine may actually be remarkable when viewed as component of a grander totality. A singular block signifies little, but a barrier of blocks together creates a stronghold. Similarly, with Jesuit establishments distributed throughout the planet. They may seem separate, but collectively they form a framework of fidelity and impact that makes the Society of Jesus one of the most apparent yet misinterpreted frameworks in society. Among the numerous characteristics that distinguish the Jesuits, none is more remarkable than their pledge of submission. From the start, Ignatius of Loyola required not solely rigour, but a readiness to follow, as if the instruction of a leader were the instruction of Christ himself. This degree of surrender astonished external observers who frequently perceived it as unthinking or even hazardous. Yet within the organisation it was comprehended not as frailty, but as capability. Submission became the basis of cohesion, an approach that enabled the Jesuits to function like a singular entity throughout land masses and generations. Envision an evangelist dispatched to China during the year 1580. He obtains a communication from Rome directing him to modify his methodology with regional authorities. He follows without hesitation, even if it requires relinquishing months of effort. That gesture of surrender may appear like defeat, but in reality it becomes a type of authority, for it maintains him coordinated with the grander purpose and guarantees that thousands of Jesuits can function collectively with unified thinking. This capacity to operate as a synchronized framework provided the organization an influence that even rulers coveted. While monarchs battled to manage their aristocrats, the superior general could guide his affiliates with an exactness that made the Society of Jesus resemble a military without weapons. Detractors termed this hazardous, asserting that such submission eliminated independent thought. They worried that Jesuits would execute any directive, even opposing monarchs or nations, if it originated from their general. Publications depicted them as marionettes managed by a singular force. But Jesuits protected the pledge as spiritual rigour, an instruction to abandon arrogance and selfishness in order to fulfil a superior purpose. What made this submission so remarkable was its adaptability. It was not inflexible in the manner of troops advancing in formation, but tactical, permitting Jesuits to modify rapidly to fresh circumstances while still executing directives. An evangelist in India might alter his attire to correspond regional practices. An educator in France might modify his curriculum to satisfy political requirements. Yet both would stay constrained by the identical pledge. Submission did not eliminate personality, but directed it into a grander intention. This provided the superior general a type of authority unrivaled in the Church. He did not require military forces or riches. He required solely the fidelity of his individuals, who believed that their surrender was component of something superior. In application, this generated the perception that the general himself was a brilliant tactician, when actually his influence depended on the submission of thousands who trusted they were fulfilling divine purpose. Through him, surrender became authority, and society observed synchronization that resembled conspiracy. The discipline of submission made the Jesuits both respected and dreaded. To their advocates, it was evidence of commitment and cohesion. To their adversaries, it was evidence that the Black Pope could manipulate his adherents like elements on a gaming board. Regardless, submission evolved into the exact thing detractors blamed them for, a concealed capability that provided the organization the impression of a domain without frontiers, and a general whose directives extended throughout the planet. Throughout historical periods, the Church has encountered instances of emergency that risk to disturb its very core. Conflicts of religion, political turmoil, intellectual transformations, and controversies all challenged its capacity to persist. In numerous of these instances, one organization appeared to surface repeatedly, advancing not solely as protectors of belief, but as solution providers, repairing fractures that others could not. The Jesuits, with their rigor and worldwide scope, acquired a standing as emergency administrators of the belief, a function that reinforced both their standing and the doubt that they were essential to the Church's continuation. During the 16th century, as Protestant challengers questioned Rome throughout Europe, Jesuits became the keen instrument of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. They disputed with challengers, evangelized in antagonistic regions, and instructed Catholic adolescents in academies created to reclaim fidelity. Their capability at conviction and their composed logic frequently revived assurance where prelates and clerics had struggled. To numerous, they appeared like the Church's crisis intervention unit, sent wherever the blaze of deviation consumed most intensely. In subsequent generations, when the Enlightenment disseminated fresh doctrines that risked conventional conviction, Jesuits once more entered the tempest. They instructed philosophy and natural philosophy in methods that reconciled logic with belief, presenting the Church an intellectual protection. At a period when numerous worried religion would be eliminated by doubt. Even when they were condemned for adjusting excessively, their capacity to interact straight with fresh notions provided the Church manoeuvring room. Throughout evangelist emergencies, the Jesuits frequently remained at the forward positions. In China, when arguments intensified about whether regional practices could be harmonized with Christianity, Jesuit positions for cultural regard postponed ultimate prohibition and maintained conversation active. In the Americas, when indigenous populations opposed colonial demands, Jesuits occasionally functioned as intermediaries, defending individuals from harsher mistreatment. These functions, though disputed, made the organization seem not solely faithful to Rome, but critical in instances of threat, even in contemporary periods. The cycle persisted during the 20th century as the Church confronted political transformations and fresh community initiatives. Jesuits were frequently the ones participating on the field. They established educational institutions that became locations of argument, and they counselled pontiffs. Throughout turbulent periods, their existence in emergencies constructed an impression of dependability. Whenever disorder occurred, the Jesuits were already present, constant and equipped. Yet this standing possessed a more troubling implication. If an organization emerges at every emergency, some start to question if it flourishes on emergency, or more troubling, if it discreetly influences incidents so it can emerge as the rescuer. Adversaries blame the Jesuits of creating difficulty solely to resolve them, strengthening the mythology of the Black Pope as the concealed influence. Whether these blames were accurate or not, impression was sufficient. The Society of Jesus came to be perceived as the Church's hidden instrument, the organization that could not be dispensed with, regardless of how disputed it became. In every blaze of belief they transported water, but in accomplishing so, they additionally made themselves appear like the ones who determined which blazes consumed and which were extinguished. The mythology of the Black Pope did not stay confined in aged publications or murmured speculations. Over periods, it entered into fiction, performance, and subsequently cinema, transformed by widespread creativity until it became a contemporary legend. Fiction authors discovered in the Jesuits a flawless subject, a combination of concealment, rigor, and impact that corresponded well into narratives of scheming. By the 19th century, the impression of the superior general had become a persona in writing, occasionally depicted as a malevolent strategist, other occasions as a mysterious advisor with information no one else held. These narratives seldom concerned themselves with historical precision. What mattered was the atmosphere, the perception that behind the apparent pontiff dressed in white, there existed another persona in black manipulating the threads of historical events. The emergence of contemporary fiction provided the legend even broader scope. In suspense novels and theatrical works, the Jesuits emerged as plotters, protecting prohibited information or influencing global incidents. The superior general was portrayed as the concealed authority, occasionally more threatening than any monarch. Even when writers conceded their narratives were fiction, audiences internalized the atmosphere. The concept of the Black Pope started to exist not solely in religious study or historical records, but in the consciousness of the masses. When cinema emerged during the 20th century, the legend acquired fresh vitality. Filmmakers appreciated the juxtaposition of illumination and darkness, the impression of a persona in black garments moving in quietness while society revolved around him. Cinema and broadcast programs borrowed extensively from the mythology, incorporating Jesuit personas into narratives about worldwide conspiracies, historical information, and conflicts for management of the Church. These depictions frequently overstated reality, but they established the model in widespread society. Even individuals with minimal understanding of Catholic historical records came to accept that somewhere in Rome, an individual in black garments guided invisible powers. The cycle persisted into contemporary mass culture, from chart-topping suspense novels to documentaries. The Jesuits and their superior general are frequently portrayed as protectors of concealed collections, maintainers of prohibited information, or tacticians behind global incidents. Each retelling contributes dimensions to the legend, obscuring the boundary between reality and fiction. The Black Pope becomes less a historical position and more an emblem of supreme concealment and impact. Detractors of these depictions contend that they nourish suspicion and simplify intricate historical records to basic theatrical works. But in the realm of amusement, the Jesuits' actual history matters less than the impression they present. The media has functioned as a reflection, displaying collective anxieties and interests back to the individuals, magnifying the mystique of the Black Pope. With every narrative conveyed currently, the legend flourishes as significantly in mass culture as in religious argument. The persona of the Black Pope emerges not solely in historical texts, but in fiction distributed at transportation centres and cinema transmitted throughout the planet. Whether reality or imagination, the impression remains influential. Society may not understand the specifics of Jesuit spirituality or historical records, but it recognizes the darkness of an individual in black, the speculation of influence behind the seat, and that is sufficient to maintain the legend active. In the contemporary period, wealth has consistently been a subject that attaches to influence, and the Jesuits were no anomaly. From their earliest periods, inquiries surrounded how this organisation of clerics, constrained by pledges of destitution, succeeded to construct academies, sustain evangelism, and preserve impact throughout landmasses. Advocates indicated to contributions, patrons, and the liberality of monarchs who respected their efforts. Detractors speculated of concealed riches, properties, and hidden financial channels that made the superior general appear less like a religious authority and more like a financier in black garments. The reality was never straightforward, and it was in this unclear intermediate territory that the legend of Jesuit prosperity developed. During the 16th and 17th generations, Jesuit academies became some of the most esteemed. Prosperous families, enthusiastic to witness their descendants educated, frequently contributed territory, wealth, or endowments in appreciation. These contributions multiplied, and shortly the Society of Jesus possessed assets throughout nations. Each property sustained an academy or evangelism, supplying consistent revenue for instruction and conversion. Officially, the wealth belonged not to individual Jesuits, but to the organisation as a totality, administered for the collective benefit. Yet external observers perceived solely the expanding inventory of territories and structures, and doubt followed. In the settlements, Jesuit evangelism frequently flourished where others struggled. In South America, their settlements were systematically arranged and fruitful, exchanging commodities that generated revenue. Some rulers blamed them of operating autonomous economies, accumulating prosperity intended for the monarchy. Narratives circulated of concealed vaults in the wilderness of Paraguay or precious metal flowing discreetly into Jesuit possession. Whether inflated or not, these tales moulded the public mind, persuading countless people that the Jesuits were experts in commerce as well as devotion. By the 18th century, rumours of Jesuit riches became a tool of politics. When monarchs in Portugal, France, and Spain moved to banish the order, they defended their decisions by charging the Jesuits with monetary misconduct. Properties were taken, ledgers inspected, and holdings seized. Yet even after such defeats, the order appeared to bounce back with remarkable swiftness. This capacity to recover only fueled doubts. How could a group stripped of assets rebound so rapidly unless it possessed concealed reserves tucked away somewhere? In contemporary times, Jesuit universities and institutions continue to accept gifts from former students, supporters, and state bodies. These monetary connections are transparent, yet speculation endures that the superior general manages shadowy accounts beyond any form of scrutiny. Some conspiracy narratives even suggest that Jesuit riches rival those of the Vatican itself. Though no proof backs such assertions, the puzzle of their endurance feeds them. What remains undeniable is that money has always accompanied mission. To teach, to journey, to construct. Resources were required, and Jesuits showed talent at handling them. Their capacity to draw supporters and to shift financially gave the order both power and distrust. For their allies, it was evidence of divine favour. For their opponents, it was evidence of concealed avarice. In the mythology of the Black Pope, finance becomes yet another thread of mystery, a murmur that perhaps devotion and wealth have been more intimately woven than the world has ever been permitted to witness. Authority does not always arrive through soldiers or gold. Sometimes it comes silently, through standards, assessments, and frameworks of thinking that determine what people study and how they comprehend the world. The Jesuits became experts of this gentler mode of power. By establishing the limits of schooling, by steering theological discussion, and by examining moral questions, they fashioned what some have termed an invisible index, a method of determining which concepts were permitted to spread and which would be quietly dismissed. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church maintained a formal index of prohibited books, a catalogue of texts that believers were forbidden to encounter. While this was an open act of restriction, the Jesuits crafted more nuanced instruments. Their colleges, praised for structure and excellence, built syllabuses that moulded entire generations of pupils. The Ratio Studiorum, a document issued in the year 1599, set forth precise regulations for instruction. Grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology were all arranged in definite stages. This blueprint was not merely about knowledge, it was about steering intellects to reason in ways that harmonized with Catholic belief. Students formed in Jesuit institutions brought these frameworks with them into roles of influence, affecting governance, literature, and scholarship. Beyond lecture halls, Jesuits also held a position in examining theological concepts. As confessors, counselors, and thinkers, they were frequently consulted to assess matters of teaching. Their assessments held influence not because they possessed official power over the Church, but because their standing for keen logic made pontiffs and prelates pay attention. This granted them a silent gatekeeping function, a concept that past Jesuit examination might circulate broadly. One that fell short might vanish without ever being officially condemned. In subsequent centuries, Jesuit influence reached into ethics, particularly as scholarship progressed. When questions about medicine, commerce, or political thought emerged, Jesuit thinkers often supplied structures for determining what was permissible. Their publications shaped conversations on topics as diverse as bondage, just warfare, and human dignity. By directing these exchanges, they did not need to prohibit concepts directly. They only needed to establish the conditions under which concepts could be explored. This invisible index held strength because it was concealed in full view. Students embraced syllabuses without objection. Monarchs requested counsel without recognizing they were also accepting limitations defined by the order. Even in contemporary times, Jesuit establishments retain this function. Universities determine what writings to highlight, what moral principles to maintain, and what theological paths to promote. These choices may appear routine, but collectively they function as screens, moulding generations of authorities. Detractors contend that this subtle authority is more potent than open restriction. By directing reasoning at its source, the Jesuits guaranteed that threatening concepts rarely achieved development. Advocates view it differently, describing it as a contribution that safeguarded belief while interacting with intellect. Whichever reading one embraces, the result is evident. Through schooling, theology, and ethics, the Jesuits constructed an invisible index that directed intellects without ever seeming to dictate them, demonstrating once more that genuine power often functions best when it does not declare itself. If one could enter the chamber of the Superior General and examine his workspace in the 17th century, it would not be a crucifix or a crown that disclosed his authority, but a chart on parchment. Laid across the surface were routes of oceans and shores, marks indicating towns and missions, paths traced by messengers and vessels. For the general, this was not simply geography, it was calculation. Each mark stood for a Jesuit foothold, a fellowship of men connected by submission to him, expanding his influence across the planet. Geography held significance because the Jesuits were never limited to Rome alone. Their power resided in being present everywhere simultaneously. In Europe, they operated schools in France, Spain, and the German territories, training the coming generation of monarchs. In South America, their reductions scattered across the terrain of Paraguay and Brazil, complete settlements where belief and structure blended with indigenous customs. In Asia, their missions penetrated the palaces of China, India, and Japan, while in North America, they established fragile stations in wilderness and beside waterways. Each site contributed a fragment to the network of influence, creating a web so extensive that few dominions could match. The chart also unveiled something more profound. By positioning themselves at cultural junctions, the Jesuits secured access to currents of information and commerce. A mission in Goa linked Europe to Asia. A school in Paris prepared men who would administer territories overseas. A community in Quebec stood at the passage between Europe and the native peoples of North America. The general's chart was beyond marks and routes. It was a network where each strand reinforced the others. This geography granted the Jesuits resilience. When they were banished from one nation, they frequently redirected their activities to another. If France opposed them, Spain might still harbour them. If South America grew hostile, Asia might present fresh opportunities. Like liquid, the order seeped into the openings left by governance, always adjusting, never vanishing. Adversaries termed this elusiveness evidence of plot. Supporters termed it evidence of sacred purpose. For the superior general, it was simply calculation. Geography also signified intelligence. From each mission arrived communications filled with specifics about local monarchs, traditions, and assets. Over time, the general's chart was not merely an image of locations, but a living record of the world's shifts. Few rulers or pontiffs held such a comprehensive perspective. This rendered the Jesuits both essential and simultaneously profoundly distrusted. Even today, the Jesuit footprint remains worldwide, with schools, universities and congregations distributed across land masses. The superior general still supervises men and endeavours in numerous nations. The contemporary chart may no longer be sketched on parchment, but the concept remains identical. Geography is authority. Where you exist determines what you discover, and what you discover determines what you can shape. For centuries, the Black Pope's chart has not been an ornament, but a signal that to direct the world, you must first understand where it exists. The Jesuits have always existed in a reflection, praised by some and loathed by others. From their beginning years, the order drew critics who blamed them for ambition, scheming and concealment. These adversaries spawned pamphlets, gossip and charges that moulded common perception. Yet, curiously enough, the resistance did not eliminate the Society of Jesus. It helped establish its character, pushing the Jesuits to view themselves as a misread vanguard, an order robust enough to withstand contempt because they believed they served a greater calling. Defector accounts often stoked these tempests. Past members who departed the order sometimes turned into its most severe critics. Their inside testimonies, whether accurate or inflated, sketched images of concealed ceremonies, total submission and authority that approached despotism. Such narratives were grabbed by opponents of the Church and distributed across Europe, transforming private complaints into common scandal. Banishments added substance to doubt. When complete nations or rulers cast out the Jesuits, as occurred in Portugal, France and Spain in the 18th century, the world noticed a trend. How could one order be thrown out by so many if there was not substance behind the accusations? The sight of Jesuits departing quietly into banishment, bearing few possessions but maintaining their structure, only intensified the mythology. To allies, it demonstrated martyr-like persistence. To adversaries, it validated the notion of a threatening force that even monarchs dreaded. These reverberations of resistance extended into writing and governance. Enlightenment authors like Voltaire directed their criticism against the order, charging them with duplicity and tyranny. Politicians employed anti-Jesuit feeling to gather backing for changes even within the Church. Some bishops disliked their sway and circulated cautions about their scope. Each assault became part of the common story, solidifying the belief that the Jesuits were no standard order, but something greater, more imposing, perhaps even menacing. The Jesuits answered not only with protection but with initiative. They intensified their schools, missions and publications, using achievement as their response to opposition. They also fostered an appearance of modesty and submission, maintaining that their devotion to the Pope and to Christ exceeded any governing purpose. This gap between what they professed and what their critics blamed them for generated a friction that sustained the mythology alive. To this moment, reverberations of those age-old criticisms persist. Conspiracy narratives about the Black Pope, anxieties of concealed sway, and doubts of secret purposes all spring from the foundation laid by adversaries generations past. Yet the Jesuits themselves frequently regard these assaults as confirmation of their significance. In their perspective, being targeted demonstrates that they hold weight, that their existence disturbs those who oppose truth. Resistance, rather than removing them, became a peculiar validation of their calling. In the conclusion, the adversaries, banishments, and reverberations moulded both the order's self-perception and the world's view. The Jesuits became not only a spiritual fellowship, but a mythology crafted in the heat of opposition. And mythologies, whether cherished or dreaded, seldom disappear. The 20th century delivered upheavals to the Catholic Church, and none was more significant than the Second Vatican Council, convened between 1962 and 1965. It was a period when bishops and theologians from throughout the world assembled in Rome to reconsider tradition, update procedures, and open the apertures of the Church to the evolving world. For the Jesuits, this council represented a watershed. They had long been protectors of orthodoxy, occasionally blamed for protecting secrets and stifling disagreement. After Vatican II, however, they started to articulate more candidly about social fairness, human dignity, and intellectual liberty. The transformation was substantial enough that even the mythology of the Black Pope had to accommodate a fresh image. In the years succeeding the council, Jesuit administrators urged their members to abandon the perception of a separated intellectual aristocracy and instead march with the destitute. Missions were redefined not only as evangelizing but as partnership. Jesuits positioned themselves in ghettos, displacement centers, and battle areas. They became advocates for liberation theology in Latin America, contending that belief required response against subjugation. To numerous young Catholics, this was a renaissance, confirmation that the Jesuits were responding to the appeals of the world. But to their detractors, it resembled governance masked as spirituality. The traditional charges of scheming re-emerged, only this occasion structured around social campaigns instead of rulers and dominions. Accompanying this emphasis on fairness came a refreshed dedication to intellectual liberty. Jesuit universities welcomed exchange with scholarship, philosophy, and even unbelief. They promoted analytical reasoning rather than mechanical repetition, a daring move in an age when the Church still grappled with contemporary times. Some celebrated this as the organic outcome of Ignatius' vision, a belief unafraid of intellect. Others feared it rendered the Jesuits too autonomous, too prepared to challenge the limits of teaching. The superior generals of this period navigated a delicate balance. They proclaimed devotion to the Pope while also protecting the privilege of their members to investigate concepts that troubled traditionalists. Once more, the friction between submission and guidance became apparent, supplying the Black Pope mythology with fresh substance. The mythology transformed from narratives of concealed riches or secret ceremonies to doubts of ideological authority, as if the Jesuits were orchestrating cultural upheavals under a spiritual disguise. By the late 20th century, the Society of Jesus had become recognized as the Church's most progressive division, advocates of exchange, schooling, and fairness. The inquiry then, could the traditional mythology of the Black Pope persist in this fresh world? The response appeared to be affirmative. The presence in black garments was still present, but now he was pictured not only as a schemer of rulers, but as a planner of concepts. Whether standing with the destitute in Central America or discussing theology in European universities, the Jesuits bore an atmosphere that implied their sway remained distinctive. Changes and reframing did not eliminate the mythology, they reconstructed it. In the contemporary period, the mythology of the Black Pope adjusted to fresh terrains, confirming that some obscurities never vanish. They only alter their shape to suit the illumination that descends on them. In March of the year 2013, the world observed a moment that numerous thought would never transpire. A Jesuit was chosen. Pope Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina emerged onto the terrace of St. Peter's Basilica and presented himself simply as Francis. The astonishment reverberated through the church and further. For centuries, the Jesuits had pledged a commitment never to pursue elevated position within the structure. Their purpose was assistance, instruction and outreach, not administration of the complete church. Yet now one of their members occupied the seat of Peter, the most prominent throne in Christianity. The occurrence reshaped the narrative of the Black Pope in manners that no conspiracy speculation could have anticipated. For those who had long murmured about Jesuit sway, the selection of Francis seemed like validation of every doubt. If the Jesuit superior general was once labelled the Black Pope because of alleged concealed authority, what then could be stated when the white garments of the papacy were actually draped on a member of the order? Did this signify the Black Pope and the actual Pope had finally merged into one? The mythology appeared to collapse in on itself, obtaining fresh energy in the sequence. Francis himself reflected characteristics of the Jesuit custom. His focus on discernment, modesty, and assisting the destitute mirrored the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. He communicated with plainness, frequently abandoning ceremony and formality. He journeyed simply, resided humbly, and proclaimed about fairness and compassion. Yet beneath his gentle manner was a distinct tactical perspective, the variety that had always rendered Jesuits formidable. Detractors stated he was reconstructing the church with the identical silent precision that his order was renowned for. Supporters viewed him as a shepherd, finally delivering the essence of Ignatius to the core of the Vatican. The Zhendong was not only within the church. Throughout the world, observers indicated the paradox that the Jesuits, long doubted of manipulating threads in the obscurity, now governed openly from the absolute centre of Catholic power. The narrative of the Black Pope assumed fresh dimensions, and it was no longer about a concealed general in Rome directing occurrences from behind a veil. It was about whether the mentality of the Jesuits had transformed into the mentality of the Church itself. Francis never referenced himself as a Jesuit pope, but his foundation was impossible to disregard. His method to administration, his focus to the boundaries of society, his readiness to confront established customs, all bore the signature of his training. Whether one admired him or feared him, it was apparent that his selection obscured the boundary between mythology and actuality. The day a Jesuit became pope was the day the narrative of the Black Pope commenced a fresh section. What had once been speculation and conjecture now stood observable in the illumination of St. Peter's Square. And yet, even in complete sight, the atmosphere of enigma did not disappear. If anything, it intensified. For now the world contemplated not if the Jesuits shaped the papacy, but what it signified when they were the papacy itself. In the 21st century, the Jesuits no longer depend on parchment correspondence transported by vessels across seas. Yet their method of functioning seems strikingly recognizable. The implements have transformed, but the approaches remain identical. What once journeyed by messenger now transfers instantly through electronic networks. What was once a secured communication is now an encoded transmission. Still, the cadence is unaltered, silent synchronization across a vast chart, always monitoring, always reacting, always coordinated with a broader calling. The realm of worldwide emergencies has only rendered this approach more observable. When a natural catastrophe occurs in Asia or a displacement emergency develops in Africa, Jesuit organizations frequently materialize within days. Their schools, congregations and NGOs supply both workforce and framework. Behind the operations, the network throbs with interaction. A Jesuit in Europe may transmit resources to an associate in Latin America. Another in Rome may counsel on publicity approach. What appears like impulsive response is in fact the traditional system functioning, modified to contemporary velocity. The superior general no longer anticipates months for a correspondence. Communications materialize in current-time photos, data and accounts flow across his workspace through displays rather than documents. Yet the core of the technique is equivalent to what Ignatius of Loyola initiated in the 16th century. Intelligence flows upward, choices flow downward, and the order operates like one organism. This capacity to respond swiftly without sacrificing unity grants the Jesuits a particular advantage. States frequently falter under administration, enterprises pursue revenue. The Jesuits function with a combination of structure and adaptability that renders them efficient in emergencies. Their silent synchronization, so fluid that it seems invisible, supplies once more the traditional doubt that the Black Pope directs more than devotion. Electronic interaction has also magnified their worldwide scope. A sermon presented in Manila can be transmitted in Rome. A presentation delivered in Boston can motivate pupils in Nairobi. The network that once depended on vessels and couriers is now immediate, permitting the order to mould discussions globally. Some detractors contend that this renders the Jesuits too powerful, that their capacity to coordinate reasoning and response across frontiers amounts to gentle authority on a magnitude no other spiritual order can equal. Advocates respond that it is simply loyalty to calling, a persistence of what they have always accomplished with the implements of the period. Traditional approaches in a contemporary world generate a potent, peculiar, dual perception. On the one surface, the Jesuits appear ageless, still engaging discernment, quietness, and submission. On the other surface, they seem completely contemporary, proficient in electronic platforms and worldwide conversation. This combination sustains the mythology alive. The Black Pope is no longer pictured only as a presence with concealed correspondence in a shadowy chamber. He is also pictured as an administrator with entry to an electronic network, directing synchronization at the velocity of illumination. Whether mythology or actuality, the awareness persists. Contemporary implements may alter the resonance, but the composition remains identical, silent, constant, and always just beyond the boundary of observation. The approach persists. At the core of the Jesuit order rests a contradiction. Ignatian spirituality, emerging from the perspective of Ignatius of Loyola in the 16th century, demands humility, discernment, and a profound personal connection with God. It highlights responding to the movements of the Spirit, pursuing liberation from egotistical impulses, and selecting paths that guide to greater contribution. On the exterior, this appears to oppose centralized authority. It requests each member to perceive God in his own awareness and to evaluate choices thoroughly. Yet the absolute framework constructed on this spirituality transformed into one of the most centralized and regimented orders in existence. How did a path intended to liberate the spirit also fashion a system blamed for constructing the mythology of the Black Pope? Part of the explanation rests in submission. Ignatius maintained that genuine liberation arrived from relinquishing individual intention to a superior purpose. The commitment of submission was not about destroying uniqueness, but about eliminating arrogance that could fragment the order. By surrendering to superiors, Jesuits were intended to discover greater harmony with God's intention. However, in execution, this signified that an enormous quantity of confidence and power flowed upward to the superior general. What was conceived as spiritual coordination became, in the perception of observers, as a mode of centralized authority. Discernment contributed another dimension. Jesuits are prepared to contemplate before responding, to evaluate inner tranquility and extended consequences before executing choices. This technique generates thoughtful individuals, but when directed collectively by one administrator, it can resemble a framework of measured planning. Each Jesuit responds to his spirit, but the superior general responds to all of them, directing their contemplations into worldwide guidance. This granted the order a standing for strategizing that appeared less like devotion and more like authority. Even the engagement of the spiritual exercises contributes to this contradiction. Weeks of quietness, contemplations on the existence of Christ, and evaluations of awareness are intended to refine the spirit. For Jesuits, it constructs humility and concentration. For observers, the structure appears like preparation, almost martial in its precision, generating men capable of tolerating difficulty and executing orders without reluctance. What was intended as spiritual engagement became understood as conditioning for authority. Does Ignatian spirituality oppose authority or facilitate it? Perhaps it accomplishes both. By instructing humility, it protects against arrogance. But by requiring submission, it directs energy into a singular direction. By developing inner liberation, it opposes worldly scheming. But by coordinating that liberation under one superior, it generates extraordinary unity. This duality is why the Jesuits have been perceived both as sacred and as schemers, as protectors of belief and as manipulators of rulers. The theology of authority in Ignatian spirituality may not have been deliberate, but it is genuine. It granted the order a framework that magnified the function of the superior general. And in that magnification, the mythology of the Black Pope discovered productive foundation. A spirituality intended to liberate the spirit concluded crafting an order that the world perceives as both profoundly spiritual and profoundly powerful. A contradiction that has never been reconciled. There is a narrative told in murmurs of a chamber deep within Rome, a location recognized not by its magnificence, but by its designation. It is not indicated on visitor charts, and no escort directs pilgrims to its entrance. In actuality, it may not exist whatsoever, but as an allegory, it has existed for centuries in the intellects of those who question how threads of Jesuit sway converge. Within this pictured space stand 4 columns, each representing a manner the Society of Jesus has contacted the world. Instruction is the first. Volumes line the surfaces, deteriorated from centuries of use, the titles spanning from Aristotle to contemporary physics. Here, young intellects are moulded not only in characters and reasoning, but in structure and discernment. It is in these lecture halls that future monarchs and thinkers emerge carrying the lasting mark of Jesuit teaching well beyond their school days. The second foundation is confession. In the room's corner rests a wooden confessional, simple yet profound. It serves as a reminder that spiritual guidance has historically doubled as a pathway of power. Monarchs and advisors once knelt before Jesuit confessors, revealing both transgressions and confidential matters. What aimed to mend the spirit frequently reached into political spheres, reinforcing the notion that the Black Pope wielded influence not through military force, but through moral authority. The third foundation is counsel. A desk occupies the centre, covered with correspondence, charts, and documents. It represents the enduring practice of Jesuit guidance. Counsellors positioned alongside rulers and pontiffs, delivering words that held greater impact than directives. To advise is not to dictate, yet intelligent guidance has frequently determined the direction of nations. Here in room 33, that counsel feels like an undercurrent moving quietly through history's depths. The fourth foundation is leadership. Along the distant wall sits the chair of the superior general, modest in appearance, yet powerful in meaning. From this position, instructions spread outward to institutions, missions, and communities distributed throughout the globe. It is not a monarch's throne, but the seat of a maestro, directing an ensemble that extends across land masses. Leadership here is less about dominance than about coherence, uniting thousands of individuals through the practice of obedience. Room 33 is not a structure of stone and cement, but a symbol for how these 4 elements combine. Education moulds intellects, confession reaches souls, counsel directs leaders, and leadership synchronizes effort. Together they produce the atmosphere of a concealed space where the society's power accumulates before flowing back into the world. The metaphor persists because it reflects something genuine, even if the room itself exists only in folklore. Somewhere among lecture halls, confessionals, chambers, and the general's quarters lies the junction where authority and faith converge. To envision Room 33 is to envision the enigma of the Black Pope himself, a representation of how multiple routes can guide to one nucleus, concealed yet visible, plain yet remarkable, quiet yet resonating through time. Authority typically displays a crown, controls militaries or secures votes. It manifests in standards hoisted above fortresses, formations of troops, or the endorsements of legislators. Yet there operates another form of authority, more subtle and frequently more permanent, that does not require troops or elections to endure. It is the authority of tradition, the moulding of perspectives, the establishment of standards, the gradual integration of power into the essence of everyday existence. For generations, the Jesuits have represented this form of influence, one that scholars describe as cultural dominance. Reflect on what it means to operate schools that train not only commoners, but nobility. A youth educated in a Jesuit institution does not simply acquire Latin or science. He internalizes principles, structure, and a perspective that will direct him when he becomes an official or monarch. By the time he wields authority, the crown may sit on his head. But the concepts informing his choices were established long earlier. The authority is unseen yet tangible, influence without a crown. This reaches into arts and learning. Jesuits charted the heavens, examined languages, and advanced mathematics. Their intellect gained admiration well outside religious institutions. In distributing knowledge, they also determined the inquiries others would pursue and the structures within which solutions were discovered. Power in learning and thought is not imposed by command. It expands by reputation, by becoming the authority that others consult when seeking understanding. That too is influence, gentler yet more enduring than armed victory. Confession provided another dimension. A commander might direct fighters, but a Jesuit confessor could shape the judgment of a ruler. The battlefield determines who prevails in combat, but the confessional may determine whether the combat commences at all. Here again is influence without boundaries. Authority wielded not over territory, but over the human soul. Even banishment could not eliminate this power. When monarchs removed the Jesuits, their institutions emerged elsewhere. Their publications kept spreading. Their concepts discovered new ground in remote territories. Unlike kingdoms that crumble when forces are vanquished, cultural influence moves easily. It persists because it exists in recollection, in practices, in perspectives formed long before. This is why the mythology of the Black Pope continues. He does not govern a realm in the conventional manner. He controls no vessels or forces. Yet the organization he directs has long been suspected of guiding the flows of thinking, learning, and conviction. Whether these suspicions overstate or not, the impression demonstrates how authority without a crown can seem even more impressive than authority with one. Cultural dominance is challenging to quantify, yet its consequences are evident. It establishes the parameters of discussion, the boundaries of possibility, the understanding of what is acceptable and what is inconceivable. That is the domain where Jesuits have frequently operated discreetly, shifting the trajectory of history not through conflict, but through power. Influence without a crown may appear gentle and weak, but it is also more lasting. Thrones shatter, boundaries shift, and forces collapse. But the intellect, once moulded, can transmit a teaching across generations. The narrative of the Black Pope exists somewhere between darkness and light, never completely validated, yet never completely rejected. On one hand exist the legends, tales of covert governors, concealed riches and schemes extending across ages. On the other hand lies the organization, a religious society bound by pledges, guided by a superior general and charged with teaching, outreach and duty. Between these two extremes rests an uncertain zone where fact and fiction merge, where the mythology flourishes because it is impossible to clarify, to distinguish legend from actuality. We must first acknowledge the scope of the Jesuits. They constructed one of the most extensive systems of schools and colleges in existence. They journeyed further and adjusted more effectively than many other religious societies. Their administrators supervised a worldwide network long before contemporary technology made such management simple. These realities alone clarify why they seemed so influential. At the same time, charges of global supremacy or covert authority often disclose more about collective anxiety than about Jesuit truth. The framework of the Society of Jesus is rigid but clear in its architecture. Each participant reports to supervisors, who in turn report to the superior general. The general himself reports to the Pope. Choices are reached through documentation, deliberations and judgment, not through mysterious ceremonies of concealed authority. What seems like a sinister plot is frequently the result of organization and correspondence. Yet the legend endures because organization itself can resemble concealment. A person who complies without question, an educational system that generates faithful elites, a confessor who murmurs into the ear of a monarch. Ruler. All generate the appearance of a shadowy apparatus. It is not that the Jesuits created these doubts. It is that their success made them a logical focus for them. Even the organization's own continuation through expulsion and persecution contributed to the mystique. How could a group so repeatedly targeted still emerge with such vitality? For some, the explanation was devotion and determination. For others, it was evidence of unseen forces at play. The uncertain zone expands here, where reality and apprehension interweave. Contemporary times have only intensified this contradiction. Jesuits advocate human dignity, social equity and learning, frequently at the expense of governmental opposition. Yet detractors perceive in these very missions another form of power-shaping communities by establishing the ethical discussions of the era. Actuality shows clergy instructing in lecture halls, assisting in displacement centres and producing academic writings. Legend envisions them composing covert plans in hidden chambers. Both portraits coexist simultaneously, neither completely accurate nor completely inaccurate. The Black Pope remains influential as a concept precisely because he is impossible to characterize. He is a representation of apprehension for some, of respect for others, and of intrigue for all. The difficulty is to acknowledge the accomplishments and power of the Jesuits without yielding to distortion. The fact may not be as exciting as mythology, but it is no less significant. Consider this point. In the uncertain area between legend and actuality lies the account of how impression itself can generate authority, sometimes more powerfully than forces or crowns. Behind the veil of speculation and mythology, the superior general is not a magician shrouded in mystery, but a person of mortal substance. He awakens early, meditates, examines, communicates, receives guests, and authorizes correspondence. He bears the responsibility of a system that encompasses the globe, yet he does so without a crown, without forces, and without territories to protect. His instruments are language, concepts, and connections. The designation Black Pope makes him appear like a spectre, yet in reality he is a tactician, maneuvering the intricacies of a worldwide church. The position requires organization and vision. Each choice extends outward across land masses. A modification in the program of a Jesuit college in Manila may influence officials for generations. A statement of encouragement sent to a missionary in Africa may affect a community or even a national directive. The general seldom issues orders like a commander on a battleground. Instead, he steers, influences, and coordinates, guaranteeing that the Society of Jesus remains one entity despite being dispersed across territories and traditions. Detractors picture him as a governor above the Pope, but the actuality is more nuanced. His power is substantial but constrained, influential but always in conflict with the wider church. What makes him distinctive is not supremacy, but the capacity to coordinate power through perseverance and deliberate preparation. To perceive the superior general as merely a manipulator is to overlook the humanity of the position. Each individual who has held the designation struggled with obstacles, uncertainties, and individual weaknesses. Some were passionate innovators, others were prudent organizers. All of them received both the esteem and mistrust that the position generates. The legend of the Black Pope may amplify their scope, but it does so because the notion of a single individual quietly influencing worldwide thinking is compelling, and perhaps it captures something authentic, even if warped. In an era where influence, subtle authority matters more than raw strength, the superior general embodies a form of guidance that feels both timeless and current. He does not govern territories, but he trains those who will. He does not direct forces, but he molds judgments that determine whether forces advance. He does not occupy position, but he affects the inquiries that administrations, colleges, and congregations raise. In this manner, his power is integrated into the invisible structure of tradition and conviction. As the veil lifts, the Black Pope stands exposed not as a sinister master, but as a person whose authority lies in finesse. His capability is in calculation, perseverance, and the capacity to navigate through time without leaving clear traces. And this presents the ultimate inquiry, one that reverberates far beyond the boundaries of Rome. In a reality where subtle authority directs more than armaments and concepts move quicker than forces, who actually governs? Is it the monarch with the crown, the leader with the ballot, or the individual who moulds the way both of them reason? Perhaps the resolution is never obvious. Perhaps the genuine governors are those we seldom observe, those who operate behind veils, those who recognize that quietness itself can be the most powerful expression